Hey guys, Montel here, and welcome to this edition of Free Thinking with Montel. You know, an estimated 6.2 million Americans aged 65 and older are living with Alzheimer's dementia in 2021. It's just kind of crazy in the fact that it breaks down to about 1 in 9 people aged 65 and older, and those numbers will increase substantially over the next few years as our population ages. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive neurological disorder that causes the brain to shrink and the brain cells to die. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, a continuous decline in thinking, behavioral, and social skills that affects a person's ability to function independently. My guest today is an emeritus professor of psychiatry and medicine at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He's the founding director of the Division of Geriatric Psychiatry and the first holder of the Richman Family Chair in Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. He's published more than 300 articles and books, chapters, and is the author and co-author of 8 books, including The 36-Hour Day, Practical Dementia Care, and Why Things and Getting Older Without Getting Anxious. Dr. Peter Rabins, thank you so much for being a part of Free Thinking with Montel today, sir.
Thanks for having me, Montel.
Absolutely. I think we share a mutual friend, Dr. Kaplan.
Absolutely. He's a very good friend. Great guy.
He's a great guy. One of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. I really admire him and admire a lot of the work he does. He works in, neurological disease, psychiatry. It's just incredible at Johns Hopkins. That you're
absolutely. That's how we know each other, right?
Super. Absolutely. Well, look, a lot of people we just gave the numbers of 6.5 million people suffering today, but that's 6.5 million families. So that means that, just add 1 to that, that's 13 million people suffering, even though the individual family member isn't suffering from the symptoms of the illness. They're suffering from the illness because they have to be a caregiver to a person like this. I have to tell you, for complete disclosure, that I and my family are going through an issue right now with an elderly member of our family that has suffered a stroke about 4 months ago, and it's completely changed the person that they are. They are suffering from dementia, something that the doctors at his care center are calling what is it?
Is it vascular dementia?
Well, he had a stroke, and now he's suffering from something. It's almost like sundown syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
But that sundown syndrome is now spread throughout almost all the hours of the day. He literally has, this person has, a few good hours every day. Though he's very much speech impaired from a stroke and has some physical disability from a stroke also, 90 years old. But he is deteriorating, it's on a steady decline. I can't say that it speeds up every single day, but he has issues that, the entire family, with us, I just said, you add the family members, you add 1. Well, with us, it's, you add 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 people who are all involved in trying to help with his care in some way. I mean, got two primary caregivers who are trying to help out at a live-in facility, but, and then all of his friends are trying to circle around to help him. But, there's really, I don't believe he's going to get any better. I don't know. And the doctors don't believe he's going to get any better. And you can see a very steady decline in his capabilities. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like he's suffering and the family's suffering. That's why this is such a challenge.
Correct. And, let's start off by defining, or not defining, but maybe you can explain what the difference is in dementia and Alzheimer's. Now, he has not been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but he has been diagnosed with a form of dementia. And again, they call it sundown syndrome, and they've given him a couple other terms. But what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's?
Yeah. It's a great place to start because many people are confused about all these words. So, dementia is just a general medical word that refers to any disease that starts in adulthood and impairs your ability to think clearly and to function in everyday life. So there are about 100 different illnesses that fall under that simple, definition of a decline in thinking. And it turns out that Alzheimer's disease, which I can define in a minute, is the most common cause, as you said. But there are many other causes, Parkinson's disease, for example. Occasionally, a disease like lupus or multiple sclerosis can even occasionally cause dementia because in some people they affect thinking. But in people who've had stroke or Alzheimer's, everyone has the thinking problem, so everyone has dementia.
That's crazy. When you just said that, it doesn't throw me, but I did suffer from a pretty severe hemorrhagic stroke now almost 4 years ago. I'm very blessed because I've been working on some other things and working on some things, but you know, I really almost am back 100%. Especially, I never really had any difficulty cognitively, even during the period of time. Though I would say that during my first 5 days of my stroke, I spent 30 days in the hospital. First 5 days of my stroke are completely gone. I don't remember any of them, other
Mm.
than every occasionally waking up and going back to sleep. Um, but then I set about and I think some of the things that I've done and been able to do have impacted, my abilities. I've got myself back physically. I had no physical, very few physical symptoms that have lingered on. Um, but I sit in fear, thinking that that damage that happened to my brain is going to down the road cause me some additional issues.
Yeah. But the amazing thing, Montel, is that particularly with a stroke, which is a one-time event, the brain can recover, and it's amazing. It continues to recover for a few years. So the fact that you're probably still getting a little better illustrates the fact that there's a lot of recovery in the brain if you do the rehab and continue to work and think and stimulate yourself. So
Okay.
glad you're doing so well.
Well, I thank you so much. And again, it's one of those illnesses that I just think people don't have as much information about as we need, especially from a family standpoint. I mean, let's talk a little bit about once dementia starts. Is it something that can reverse itself? Is it something that can, a person can get better from?
Right. So again, as I mentioned, about 100 different diseases can cause it. So it really depends on the cause. Probably 1% of people who have the symptoms, it turns out that they're due to medication or a medical illness, like even thyroid disease can cause the symptoms. So it's very
Wow.
important that everybody be evaluated by a doctor to make sure, even though it's rare, that they don't have one of the rare causes that can be treated. But for most people who have dementia, it's a progressive illness and gradually gets worse over time. Some of the causes go more rapidly, others go more slowly. And if it's due to having had two or three different strokes, if you can stop the strokes from happening, you can stop it from progressing.
Okay. What are some of the signs of the onset of dementia?
Yeah, probably the we focus on the fact that people are forgetful and can't remember things and repeat themselves. But equally common is the fact that people start to have trouble doing things they've easily done all their lives. So sometimes the first symptom is someone who's always paid their taxes, for example, and then all of a sudden has trouble doing that, or someone who's been a good housekeeper or liked cooking, they start to have trouble doing that, or they start having trouble doing their finances. So the earliest symptoms are often sort of organizing life and doing things that you've always done automatically.
Is this just a natural part of life, the aging process, or is it something that 10% of people will have, 20% of people will have, or 90% won't have?
Yeah. Most people now think that no, this is not normal aging. It's a group of diseases that starts to become common when you get older. The older you are, the higher your risk of cancer, the higher your risk of stroke and heart attack, and the higher your risk of Alzheimer's. So they're associated with age, but we don't think age is the cause. And there are many people over 100 who are absolutely clear and normal in their thinking. So we think it's a disease distinct from aging, but that aging is a risk factor.
And and thinking in that way, and I've seen some stories and some things, reports written recently that kind of say aging is a disease. Is that true?
I guess it gets down to what you define as disease.
Right.
But again, if you define disease as there's something in the body that's abnormal, and you look at the brains, there are, over age 80, a large number of people have absolutely normal brains, and a significant proportion do have diseases in their brain. But if we just look at brain aging, even up to age 100, it doesn't appear inevitable. So I think it's distinct, and I think it's helpful to realize that it is distinct from aging, but that it really does interfere with people's lives, and that's the hard part of it.
Who's most at risk for dementia?
Well, like a lot of common conditions, it's a combination of genetics and environment, and we don't quite, know how to tease all that out. But probably somewhere around 50 or 60% of the risk is genetic. So that means that somewhere around 50% has to do with something in the environment. So it does run in families. If you have a parent with it or a brother or sister, your chances are of getting Alzheimer's disease specifically are increased. But we also think that if we work hard to control blood pressure, particularly beginning in midlife, if people stay active mentally and physically and socially, and they control their other risk factors for heart disease, lower their cholesterol, keep their weight down, exercise, as I said, all those things can be somewhat preventive. So inactivity and vascular disease in your body, heart disease, et cetera, probably all somehow contribute to Alzheimer's.
Wow. And then what are the stages of Alzheimer's? Because
Well,
I read an article also recently that Alzheimer's is something that can start as early as in your 20s, right? But won't manifest itself sometimes until 40, 50, 60, 70.
exactly right. So there are two aspects of it. First, very rare cases start in people's 40s and 50s. So it's not only old people, but those are really unusual cases. However, what we have learned in the past few years is that the brain changes of Alzheimer's, they're occurring 15 to 20 years before the first symptom. So if somebody develops symptoms in their 70s, their brain's probably been changing since they were in their 50s or early 60s.
Wow. And I mean, I'm just wondering with, research and with the science that we have available today, are we looking at ways that can slow that progression down if in fact you identify those changes in the 50s?
Absolutely. That is a huge focus of research. And just in the last couple of years, brain scans have been developed that seem to be able to identify these very early brain changes. And we're really on the cusp of having blood tests and spinal fluid tests that might be able to detect the abnormal proteins uh, long before people have symptoms. So the hope in the long run is we figure out who's at risk in their 50s and 60s, start them on some type of treatment, and then they never develop the disease, because all these diseases in some way or another are related to abnormal proteins. And the hope is if we can remove those proteins from the body and from the brain, we'll prevent the disease from ever happening.
I'm on the Ann Romney's Neurological Center board in Brigham and Women's in Boston. And this is on every one of our board meetings. And Ann Romney started it because of MS, but also they're looking at all diseases of
Yeah.
brain. And, I have some fascinating board meetings with them just listening to the research and where they are moving forward. So, are there treatment protocols that are currently available for patients with Alzheimer's? I
Well,
remember.
about 20 years ago, a few medications were approved. And it turns out what these medicines do is they don't stop the disease from progressing, but they help about a third of people with their symptoms, so they can mildly improve memory symptoms. But just recently, the FDA approved the first drug that removes one of these abnormal proteins called the beta amyloid protein. Now, that's the great news is that this protein, the drug is very dramatic in removing the protein. That's really great. So far, that hasn't translated into dramatic improvement in the people taking it. But we really only have information out about 18 months or 2 years, and it might take longer to have an effect. I think that's the hope. But at least now we've moved toward drugs that target what at least many people, including people at the Brigham there, the group that at the N. Romney Center are focused on. And that really does offer hope. And if those drugs aren't right on track toward preventing it in some way or another, I think.
No, but now does that give you some insight into thinking that maybe is not as well, if the drug works dramatically at reducing the protein, but it doesn't reduce the symptoms, are we looking in the wrong direction or we still think we're looking in the right direction?
Well, you're thinking like a scientist. It could be either one. It may be that it's the wrong protein. It has nothing to do with the disease. It may be that, remember, if this has been going on for 15 or 20 years,
Right.
maybe you have to take it at the beginning. That if you wait 15 years when you have the very most subtle symptoms, it's already too late. Many brain cells are already dead. Your brain is shrinking, as you mentioned in the introduction. So I think going forward, um, people will be targeting earlier and earlier times to hopefully maybe stop things from getting to the point where they're irreversible.
Gotcha. And at least knowing that there is a medication that can eliminate some of the protein, there may be an opportunity to find, maybe we'll identify another protein or something else that's leaving a marker that we haven't even discovered yet. Is that right?
Exactly. So there are two abnormal proteins in Alzheimer's disease, one called this amyloid and the other called tau. So
All
some
right.
scientists think you have to remove both. And it's not, so the amyloid comes first in most people, the tau is second. And perhaps you have to really prevent both from forming to stop the disease and allow the brain to recover.
Now, does there seem to be a higher prevalence of the disease in recent man than there was in, earlier man? I mean, let's look back, 500 years ago, or even look back 100 years ago. Do we see the same prevalence of Alzheimer's that we see now, or is it because of the fact that we are now 100 years later living that much longer? So
Yeah.
therefore, this just happens to be something that's happened because of our own ability to live longer.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. What we do know is the disease has been around for thousands of years. There are descriptions of the disease in Egyptian papyri that are 4,000 years old. So it's not a new disease. Um, and it may well be that it's just that we're, for the first time in human history, the average person is living to age 80. Even in the 1960s, average life expectancy was only about 65. And it turns out it really, as you asked earlier, it's associated with aging. So it's an uncommon disease at 65, but by age 80, about 20% of people have Alzheimer's. So something is happening with aging, and this is the first time in human history where so many people have lived into that age of risk.
Al, I know that maybe you can speak to this a little bit. There's some studies that have linked, this between common medications and the higher risk for dementia. Is there a link between maybe the processed foods that we're eating now and a higher risk for dementia or for Alzheimer's. Is there a link there, do you think?
Well, I mean, people have been looking at that. I think so far there's no smoking gun. On the other hand, I think there's pretty good evidence that people who eat a so-called Mediterranean diet, less red meat, more olive oil rather than butter or other fats, a lot of fruits and vegetables, that there is some evidence that that can lower the risk. So it's not a slam dunk yet, but that would go along with the idea that maybe the modern diet has contributed. And I think it's still an open question, but an important one.
And that kind of brings me to a question of, is there something that you just said, the Mediterranean type diet and eating, less animal based fats and more plant based oils and things could that potentially help delay the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's?
I think the answer is potentially yes. And I think again, while the evidence isn't a slam dunk yet, personally, I think the evidence is good enough and it's not just Alzheimer's. We know that that kind of a diet lowers the risk of heart attack and stroke. So, it's a triple win. So I do think the evidence is good enough that we all ought to be trying to eat better in that way.
Absolutely, and not just from a red meat standpoint, but I often have wondered about just the level of the processing of the food that we do now. It's very weird to me, very interesting. You hear all these people screaming and crying about, I don't know what's in the vaccine for COVID, yet they will put anything in their mouth that you can put in front of them to eat, and they don't know what's in their food. So, I mean, could there be a connection between some of the other chemicals that we have been using and without using almost without any, abatement at all? Could that also be causing some of this or be a contributor?
Well, again, I think it's still an open question. I don't think anyone strongly linked it to Alzheimer's disease, but there is reason to think that certain chemicals are linked to developing Parkinson's disease. And perhaps half of people who develop Parkinson's disease eventually develop dementia. So, in a way, the answer is if you're looking at dementia broadly, I think the answer is yes, it may well, those processed foods or other chemicals in the environment, pesticides, might be contributing.
Wow. And what about, in recent times, I say recent, the last 30 to 40 years, since we've had more contact sports at an earlier age, in schools and things like that, could, the idea of TBIs or smaller TBIs and those kinds of things affect the brain? You've got children playing football and contact sports and wrestling, all these things from about the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and now we're starting to see those kids, my age group, 50s, 60s, getting to a point where now there is a higher rate of dementia among this generation. Could some of that be a contributing factor also?
Well, I think the answer is yes. If you look at concussions, people have had concussions, and they're most studied in contact sports, not just football, but what we call soccer,
Sure.
European football, hockey. Um, People do seem to be at higher risk of developing dementia, so-called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We hear a
Mhm.
lot about that in football players. And it turns out that the abnormality in the brain of those people is the tau protein. And I mentioned before the tau protein, the abnormal tau, is seen in Alzheimer's. So there could well be a link between repeated head trauma and Alzheimer's. People have looked hard for that for 30 or 40 years. And it's hard to get good information what happened to you when you were 20 or 30.
Sure.
But I think there's reason to think that that's one of the contributors.
I mean, I think there's been some research done recently on the fact that, one of the groups, young women, a lot of young females who play soccer, end up with lots of different maladies in their mid 30s and 40s and early 50s. And when you go back and take a look at some of their early life careers, well, they were playing the sport that they thought wasn't a contact sport, but bouncing a ball off the front of their head 30 times at practice and trying to snap a ball with their head, during a game, cause repeated TBIs that we're now starting to recognize, right?
I think that might well be true. Yeah, it's a real concern.
Absolutely. And, what about the impact of, let's say, alcohol consumption? Has research shown that alcohol consumption plays a part in this at all?
I think, well, most people believe that heavy alcohol use over an extended period of time does cause a dementia. I would say it's not 100% of scientists agree, but many people do think that. No one's really linked that to Alzheimer's disease specifically or other kinds of dementia, except uh, to general dementia. And the challenge in part is that many people who drink heavily don't eat well or experience head trauma. They fall down, they hit their head a lot. So it's been hard to disentangle all those things. But alcohol, heavy use of alcohol, very likely is a cause of dementia.
And what about again? You mentioned it a little bit earlier, but how about your genetic component? What's the connection? I mean, if your parents have dementia, will you probably have it, or you are at a greater risk of having it?
But you're definitely at greater risk if you have one parent who had an Alzheimer-like dementia. Your risk is about triple someone whose parents lived to their 80s and didn't have it. So there's a very clear genetic contribution, and a number of genes have been identified that contribute to the risk. So it might be that in the future, when we're trying to discover in people's 50s and 60s who's at risk, it might be a combination of looking at their genes and doing one of these tests that measures the abnormal proteins.
Gotcha. And I mean, you let's say, okay, you're already at the point where you've identified a family member, and who has dementia or is suffering from Alzheimer's. Two different things. Again, Alzheimer's. Right now, we don't know. There is no cure.
Mhm.
But are there things that are important for people, the family members or caregivers, to consider when it comes to caring for loved ones who are suffering from Alzheimer's dementia or dementia period? Like, in our case, I mean, as family member of ours who, it's been really, really a strain on the family over the course of the last 4 months because he has some good days, and then he just has some days that just don't even seem like it's the same person.
Mhm.
And now we're starting to recognize that it's not that it's every couple of days, though it seems like there's a periodicity to his outbursts. But that's when I think he probably gains enough strength to go ahead and have an outburst. He's probably having those outbursts silently in his bed, and then every couple of days he feels strong enough to get up and then really, really act out. But I don't think that it's something that's happening every couple of days. I think it's probably happening, from my perspective, I think it's happening more often than we all think it is. Is there anything that we should think about in trying to care for him? I mean, there are days, I'll say this. He has these outbursts and he acts out. And then, the next day he doesn't even remember that he had that outbreak or he acted out. And if you explain it to him, then he is very empathetic and
Mhm.
saddened by the fact that that happened. But then again, it'll happen again the next day, and he doesn't remember that it happened that day. So, I mean, how do we is there any value in trying to remind him that you're doing these things when he may not even remember that you had that conversation tomorrow?
Well, let me come to that last question, but I think you started out asking, are there things that families can do to maybe help make the situation better? And I think
Sure.
in general, I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think
Yeah.
first, you want to be as informed as possible about the person's disease. Again, dementia is just a general term. So Alzheimer's disease is different from someone who's had a stroke and has behavior problems. And there are other diseases. I mentioned Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia. So there's a whole range of diseases, and each one has different symptoms. And
Got
so
it.
I believe that the starting point is the more the family can be informed about that person's illness, the more knowledgeable they'll be, and the more then that kind of leads you to try different things. I think the second thing is to make sure the person has a good primary care doctor who's really looked at all their medications, make sure that they're taking the medications they need to be taking, but they're on the lowest possible effective dose, that there's no new medical problem causing trouble, because that can contribute. Then I think the third thing is to um, look at uh, potential triggers of the person and the behavior. So, do they occur, as you said, at certain times of the day? Um, are there certain people around when the challenging problems occur? Is the person tired? Do they need more exercise, more naps? It's different for each person, but often you can identify triggers that bring it out. And then I think finally, it's really important, and I think you're doing this, for caregivers to talk about their own distress and needs, and to recognize that the more frustrated and discouraged that they are, the more frustrated and discouraged the ill person is. And so that if you can get help yourself for some of your frustrations, and sometimes it's, as you're doing as a family, talking with each other, sometimes it's talking with a minister, a counselor, a doctor. Um, that if that helps the caregiver, that can help the ill person. So I do think there's a lot that can be done, and there are specialists who focus on the behavior challenges like the ones that you're describing. I would just say, in answer to your question, if he doesn't remember that he does these things, and that's the usual state, I don't think reminding him the next day is really beneficial, in the sense that it just makes him feel bad. But at the time, it's beyond his control. So, and that's just as a general sort of comment.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Because we thought maybe that, the idea of just not trying to say you did X, Y, Z, but just, you were a little mean last night. And then you go, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. Maybe thought that empathetic feeling going across him might help him prevent him from the next time, but that's
Yeah.
not necessarily what's been happening.
I don't think it's going to be preventive, but I do think to say to him, you had a really rough night last night. You were upset and yelling and agitated, and we know it's not something you're doing on purpose, but you know, I would be positive. We're with you. We love you. We care about you. We're going to do everything we can to make you feel comfortable. But we know that sometimes you have problems that you can't control. So I do think you want to be empathic. I think you're absolutely right. But it's not realistic to expect him, the way you're describing it, to control those things, because he really doesn't remember it. So he can't learn from it the way I hope you or I would if we were causing problems and someone said, this happened, and you realize it, and then you try to change things.
Got it. Do you think there will ever be a cure, or is there one? I mean, we know this one drug, but I'm sure science is working as feverishly as possible to get to this, because we do recognize that, we're getting ready to come up against the tide. I mean,
Yeah.
with our aging population, this is going to grow and grow and grow, and there's going to be more and more and more families affected. But do you think there'll ever be a cure in the next 10 years? Let's say in the next 10 years.
I don't know about the next 10 years. Yes, I'm optimistic on two fronts. First, I think the biggest hope is prevention. Um, that As we've already talked about, there are dietary things people can do, there are activity things people can do, stimulation. I think that's going to be important. We can't change our genetics, but we can change how our genes interact with the environment. So I think that's part of it. Second, I do think that we're going to learn more and more. The amount of information we've learned just in the past 5 or 6 years is amazing. And so I think the rate of new knowledge about all these diseases is increasing dramatically as we bring more and more researchers to focus on it. So, yes, I think that different causes of dementia, we're going to find different treatments for them. Whether we'll be able to reverse the brain damage that's already been done, I don't know. But I do think in the long run, we're going to be able to prevent most or maybe all cases by a variety of interventions, both on the environment and maybe medication and other things that we discover.
And if you one more bit of advice for those people who are the caregivers or those people who are the other family members that are suffering from the family members' dementia, what other bit of advice would you give them?
Again, I think the more informed you can be, um, the more you talk with other people so you can get some of your own frustrations out. And the more supportive then that you can be to the ill person, I think the better for you as a person and as a family member. Again, when things are like when we face really challenging problems like this, sometimes we're prone to blame other people or blame the environment or blame God, blame whatever it is. And I think if we can focus on the positives, that is, if we can focus on how we're all in this together, we're not blaming the person. We understand it's an illness. We're looking for solutions. To me, that's a win-win. It's good for us as caregivers, and then that trickles down to the person with the disease. So that has a positive benefit to them. And I think then the more that we can then engage them at whatever level they're at, if they're still a great grandparent, bring in the grandkids. If they still enjoy playing ball, we want to engage them in that. Figure out what the person can still do and try to help them maximize that. That helps them, and it also helps us as a family member because we know we're doing things to help them.
Got it. Got it. Dr. Rabins, I can't say thank you enough for being a part of Free Thinking today. I know this information that you've shared, a lot of our viewers are just going to just absorb and eat up and may even possibly want some more. So, you will always have a home here whenever you want to come back.
Great. And if I can just plug 2 books that I've written that might help
Please,
people.
please
One
do. Please do.
one is called The 36-Hour Day,
Got
and
it.
that's actually been out for 40 years. We revise it every 5 years. And then a newer book, it's called Is It Alzheimer's? And both of them are targeting family members and giving them what I hope is positive information about how to manage and cope with things.
Both of those are available on Amazon.
Yes, they are.
So, and if people wanted to reach out to you, I mean, not that I want to inundate you with emails, but is there a way that they can reach out to you or find out more about you?
I have a website, just my name, peterrabins.com, and that's available for people to contact me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ravens, for being a part of the show. Like I said, you always have a home here if you want. And I want to make sure all of you who have been tuning in today, just please make sure you continue to tune in to Free Thinking with Montel. Have a great day. Thanks for joining me on Free Thinking with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear feedback, so please send us your comments.